So good evening, everybody. My name's Jamie Cresswell. I'm here at the London Ecological Peace Centre near King's Cross in London. It's really nice to be here and to be with a small audience here as well. So thank you very much, everyone who's come in person here today. As everyone will know, it's quite an experience to be at an event in person these days. So thank you for being here, but also thank you so much for being online, those of you who are online. I'm sure you're going to enjoy the evening this evening. As you know, David Loy is here to give a talk, and also he's giving a workshop, an all-day workshop tomorrow here also at London Ecological Peace Centre. So the event today is being organised by Dharma in partnership with the Centre for Applied Buddhism, which is the centre of which I am director, Buddhists across traditions, the Triratna Earth Sangha, XR Buddhists and SGI UK. And this is an SGI UK centre that we're at today. So thank you very much to SGI UK for the use of this centre. So you have probably watched webinars over the last 2 years from at least one of those organisations that I've just mentioned. And certainly Ecodharma, as Ecodharma, we've been organising a number of webinars. Over the last few years, the climate crisis has been at the fore for many people. Been really in their minds, filled their minds with thinking and also with action. Also, we've had to deal with the COVID situation, and the two have sort of competed a little bit for space. It was true that the climate crisis sort of dropped a little bit in people's minds as COVID became bigger and bigger. However, what has happened is the whole situation has given us an opportunity for faiths to work together in a harmonious way. Faiths have come together in different ways over this issue of the climate crisis and are now working very well, taking action, contacting government, running events and attending climate conferences and so on. So faiths are making a difference. And that is the same for Buddhism. And I'm very pleased to say that a number of Buddhist networks have sprung up over the last couple of years, specifically devoted to working towards sorting out the climate crisis. So I found this very encouraging. When the NBO, the Network of Buddhist Organizations, was formed in 1993, we were mostly concerned with bringing about understanding and harmony within the Buddhist community, if we can call it that, amongst different Buddhist organizations. It was quite inward looking in that sense. But now we are much more outward looking. The NBO has worked much more in running events such as Buddhist Action Month and setting up the Ecodharma network. And we're much more focused on looking outwards to make a social change, political change, ecological change. So I think there has been something very positive in the situation that we've experienced over the last few years in terms of people coming together. And faiths can be very powerful. They're a large part of society. So I think it is possible to make changes through the faith dimension. Of course, interconnectedness is very central to the Buddhist understanding of the ecological crisis. And I'm sure David will be talking about that at some point while he is here. I know one of his very first books that he wrote was called Non-Duality. I remember reading that myself. And I know that he's talked on this topic quite a bit. So nature or the environment is not something out there. It's not something separate from us. We ourselves are nature. We are the environment. And any damage carried out to the environment is also damage to ourselves. And I think that's really important to bear in mind. Everything that we rely on as human beings is in some way derived from nature, whether it's clothes or food or fuel, or indeed our own bodies, made up as they are from the same elements that make up oceans, lands, and plants. So I would now like to introduce you to David Loy. Today's talk is entitled, "What Does the Ecological Crisis Mean for Buddhism?" So David is an American scholar. He's an author, and he's also an authorized teacher in the Sambo Zen lineage. His main interest is the dialogue between Buddhism and modernity, especially the social implications of Buddhist teachings. Mostly these days, he's involved with the Rocky Mountain Eco-Dharma Retreat Center, which he is one of the founders of. This is in Colorado, in America, and he regularly leads retreats there. So this weekend, we're really lucky to have him here in person. I never thought this would happen, but there we are. He's managed to visit various countries in Europe, this being one of them. And tomorrow, as I mentioned earlier, he is going to be giving a day-long workshop called the Bodhisattva Eco-Sattva Path Today. I'm looking forward to that. So without further ado, as they say, let me introduce you to David Loy.
Well, first of all, thank you, Jamie, for that very generous introduction. And I also want to begin by thanking Olivia and Emma, who, among many others, have worked very hard to make tonight and tomorrow possible. And I'm really grateful to them. We wouldn't be having this event without them, basically. The title of this evening's talk, as Jamie said, is "What does the ecological crisis mean for Buddhism?" Something I remember and reflect on maybe every day is what Noam Chomsky said in a recent interview. He said that this is the most dangerous moment in human history. We are now living in the most dangerous time in the history of our species. And what that always makes me reflect on and ask about is, what does that mean for the meaning of my life, for what I do with my life? What does it mean for all of us in terms of our priorities? And it also raises this really interesting question. What does Buddhism have to offer? What Buddhist teachings and practices, how can they help us understand and respond appropriately to this situation? This uniquely dangerous situation, which seems to me to require a kind of reorientation of everything. But that's not what I'm going to talk about this evening. That's the topic for the workshop tomorrow, and I hope that some of you will be able to join us for that. Instead, what I want to do is kind of turn that around and ask from the other dimension, what does this crisis mean for our religions? It seems to me this is not only a dangerous moment in human, or let me say it this way, if this is such a dangerous moment in human history, certainly it has extraordinary implications for our spiritual traditions, right? So what does it mean that this is the most dangerous moment in human history? What does this mean for Buddhism, and as well as all of the other religious traditions that we're used to? In particular, I think it really requires us to ask some very deep questions and try to sort of clarify the essence of the Buddhist teaching in order to enable us to respond most appropriately. And so what I'd like to do this evening is just share some reflections with you about that. And I guess I want to emphasize what I'm really going to be doing is raising questions. And I'll be making suggestions, making some points, but I don't mean to be dogmatic about anything. What I really want to do is sort of hopefully start us talking about the issue, because I think this is absolutely essential, right? To say it again, if this is such an incredibly critical moment in human history, it's also critical for our spiritual traditions, including Buddhism. And I think we are very fortunate that the Buddhist tradition is especially well situated to help us with this kind of inquiry, right? I think this is something that we can see that, I mean, if you think about it, from the very beginning of the Buddhist tradition, Buddhism has emphasized impermanence and insubstantiality. Everything is changing all the time. Nothing has any essence that's outside that transformation. And it's been pretty clear this also applies to Buddhism itself. I mean, we see the way that Buddhism has evolved, developed, transformed every time it's gone to a new culture. Now, we can say that about lots of different Buddhist traditions, lots of different spiritual traditions. We could say it about something like Christianity, the way Christianity has spread, and it has changed over time. But I think Buddhism in particular, when you think of, for example, about the differences between Theravada Buddhism in Southeast Asia and the texts that they refer to, the Pali Canon, and then you go somewhere like the Mahayana countries of Japan or Korea, they have totally different sutras, and there's really not much interaction or even awareness among them. I remember that when early Western scholars first went to Tibet, they didn't actually realize for a while that the kind of Buddhism you find in Tibet is actually related to the Buddhism that you find in Sri Lanka and Southeast Asia, that's actually, in a sense, it's the same tradition, although much changed. So we can see how when Buddhism spread to China, it didn't just impose itself, but it interacted with the native the native Taoist and Confucian traditions and evolved into Zen or Chan. Likewise, when Tantric Buddhism went to Tibet, it didn't just impose itself on Tibetan culture, but it actually interacted and something new was created, so sort of Tibetan Buddhism, such as we're familiar today. And so when we consider the situation of Buddhism today in this most dangerous time, in the larger context of a Buddhism spreading to a now globalized modern world, which is so completely different from anything that it's ever experienced before, we can see that there's the potential here, and our situation requires this now, not only the potential, but I think the pressure, the requirement that we really ask deep questions about the tradition. These questions have always been there. I mean, we tend to think of, say, Buddhism. Many of us might like to go back to restore or recuperate the original pure Buddhism of the Buddha. But in fact, religious meaning is always something that's being negotiated, always something that's being worked out in new generations, right? We need to remember that Buddhism was an oral tradition for at least 250, maybe 300 years. None of it was written down. And we know, although we know that things can be, that people can be very good at memorizing word for word, nonetheless, within that period of time, it would really be very strange to believe that nothing was lost, that nothing was added, that different people didn't actually, maybe teachers, people who weren't quite as enlightened as the Buddha wouldn't be able to avoid helping consciously or unconsciously imposing their own understanding of the texts, right? So what I'm saying is our task at this point is not sort of trying to return and recuperate some pure Buddhism, but rather try to find the forms of Buddhism that actually are most helpful to us in this very dangerous predicament. Yeah. And of course, when we think about what the Buddha himself actually said, for one thing, in the Kalama Sutta, the famous free inquiry, encouraging us to think and to decide for ourselves so that we know what's going on. We don't just believe something because someone says it, but when we know for ourselves that it's true. And the other really important original text is of course, this claim about the Buddhist teachings being a raft that helps us get us across to the other shore, right? And this is really important. The Buddha said, as you know, that having gotten to the other shore, we don't pick up the raft and carry it around in our back everywhere, right? His point being that the Buddhist teachings are all of them skillful means, they're upaya. It's quite different from, say, the Christian traditions where we look at the Bible, and the Bible is sort of the sacred word of God. Although we sometimes treat them that way, Buddhist traditions are not sacred. The teachings of the Buddha, as he said himself, these are teachings he rediscovered in order to be able to help us do something. And so the great challenge in our time is to figure out how we can understand and apply those teachings today, in order to keep the Buddhist tradition most alive for us today, right? So that's all kind of a preface, because basically I want to foreground, I think, a tension that exists deep within the Buddhist tradition, a tension that many of us often unconsciously negotiate, but it's something I think the ecological crisis requires us to really look at, okay? In particular, is the goal of the Buddhist tradition to somehow transcend this world of samsara, samsara being this realm of suffering, ignorance, craving? Is the ultimate goal to transcend this world in some way, to escape it? Or is it, as we find in some of the Mahayana traditions, including Chan and Zen, is rather the goal not to transcend the world, but is it somehow to become more intimate with it, to experience it in a non-dual way? Are you familiar with this? I mean, I think for all of us, we're somewhat aware of it. And the reality is, I think most of us aren't sure what to make of it. Well, what I want to do is kind of offer a way of looking at that I think might be especially helpful now. And I want to do that by referring to something Joseph Campbell said. Joseph Campbell, the scholar of mythology. He said that a lot of the problems with religion occur because people take metaphors literally. People misunderstanding religious language and the way that religious language functions. Let me read you something he said. So much of the problem in religion is because people take the symbols, metaphor symbols literally. Quote, half the people in the world think that the metaphors of their religious traditions are facts. And the other half contends they're not facts at all. So as a result, we have people who think of themselves as believers because they accept metaphors as facts. And we have others who classify themselves as atheists because they think religious metaphors are lies. And they've both got it wrong. You see, they're both misunderstanding how religious language is actually functioning. Let me give another example. Dominic Crossan, a prominent New Testament scholar and historian. I think he puts it even better. He says, quote, my point is not that those ancient people told literal stories and we are now smart enough to take them symbolically, but that they told them symbolically and we are now dumb enough to take them literally. Is the point, the traditional point about the end of rebirth, which has been the traditional goal of Buddhism, the end of physical rebirth into this world, is this an example of perhaps taking a metaphor literally? Before I go into that, let me just give an example of the sort that Crossan talks about, right? Christianity, which most of us are familiar with because we were raised in it, right? It turns out that 3 of the 4 Gospels are based on the same text. It's pretty clear. The original text, which is often called Q, has been lost, but we can tell from the stories and from the language that they're all based on this same text. The one exception is the Gospel of John, which is more metaphysical. It's also the case that all of these Gospels, none of them was written down until at least 70 years after the fact. None of them was written by anyone who actually knew Jesus. In fact, none of them was written down in the name of, we have Luke, what is it? Luke, Matthew, what am I forgetting here? These Gospels, they have the names of the disciples, but in fact, we know now that none of them were actually written by the disciples. Here's the interesting thing about that Q text. It goes up all the way to the crucifixion of Jesus, and it stops there. It doesn't include anything after the crucifixion, which means there's no resurrection according to that original text. The suggestion being that the resurrection is added later. And in fact, it's pretty clear to Testament scholars that the one who really made Christianity as we know it now is Paul, not one of the original disciples. In fact, he never met Jesus, but he knew, or he thought he knew better than anyone else, who Jesus was and what Jesus taught, you see. Do you see the point here? That this is an example of perhaps metaphors being taken literally, that something was added here that has distorted the meaning. Actually, I love the idea of resurrection, but metaphorically. I mean, we can see the same thing in Buddhism, the idea of the kind of a resurrection that can happen with awakening or enlightenment. But let's come back to the main point and just go back to Buddhism. Let's focus on Buddhism here. As we know, the Buddha left home on his spiritual quest because of his existential encounter with an old man, an ill man, and then a dead man, a corpse, right? So that made him left home. He realized this is something that was going to happen to him. And that shocked him to the point where he didn't want to continue living the kind of life he was. Instead, he went off into the forest to try to resolve this great question. And what happened? Well, he studied with a couple teachers, tried asceticism, eventually landed on meditation, was enlightened under the Bodhi tree. Then he spent, 45 years teaching. What happened to him? He got old, he got sick, and he died. So in what sense did he solve the problem? In the Buddhist tradition, and there's an interesting contrast here with, say, Christianity. Say Christianity, the idea is, as Christ shows us, the idea of eternal life. If we behave ourselves, we'll go to heaven and live forever with God. In the case of Buddhism, I think there's a deeper understanding that the issue is not eternal life, but that life and death always go together. And so for Buddhism, the way this has been understood, and I think too literally, the problem is the way to get out of samsara, the world of suffering, is not to be reborn. And so then you don't have to die. So the whole point, the way it's understood, is that when the Buddha died, that was his parinirvana, that was his last lifetime, and he wasn't going to be reborn, right? What do you think? Might that be an example of a metaphor taken literally? The reason I mention that is in the Zen tradition, we find a number of references to the unborn, but they don't refer to the experience of not being physically reborn after you physically die. They refer to a way of experiencing the world right here and now. There was a famous Chinese writer, Yung Cha, a disciple of the sixth patriarch, who proudly proclaimed, quote, "Since I abruptly realized the unborn, I've had no reason for joy or sorrow at any honor or disgrace." Notice that, since I realized the unborn, the implication being he realized it right here and now. And then later on, there's this famous Japanese, much beloved Japanese Zen master named Bankei, for whom the unborn was his central teaching. He was a very interesting guy. He actually became very ill, and it seemed like he was at the point of death from tuberculosis. And then he tells what happened. "Then I felt a strange sensation in my throat. I spat against a wall. A mass of black phlegm, large as a soapberry, I don't know, I have no idea what that is, rolled down the side. It seemed to relieve the discomfort in my chest. Suddenly, just at that moment, it came to me. I realized what had escaped me until then. All things are perfectly resolved in the unborn. I realized that what I'd been doing all this time was mistaken, all my efforts in vain." He realized the unborn, and that became his central teaching. Quote, "When you dwell in the unborn itself, you're dwelling at the very wellhead of Buddhism patriarchs. The unborn is the Buddha mind, and this Buddha mind is beyond living and dying, but it's something you can experience right here and now." Okay, well, maybe we don't quite understand what he's pointing at, but can we see the point here about literal and metaphorical? Is it possible that the enlightenment, that the awakening, that the final solution, as it were, that Buddhism is pointing to, is not about the end of physically being reborn into this world, but realizing something here and now about this world which normally escapes us, you see? If you think about this, you can probably get a sense of why I want to focus on this, because if we're experiencing this incredibly dangerous moment, this incredible challenge, to an extent that humanity has never had to deal with anything like this before, how helpful is a religious tradition when the point is ultimately to transcend and escape this world, not to be reborn into it, because we label this world of samsara as fundamentally problematic and it can't be reformed. The only idea is to escape it, you see? Or are we really talking about a different kind of transcendence, a more metaphorical transcendence, a transcendence of our usual way of experiencing the world in favor of a different way, which someone like Bankei and Yung Cha are pointing to by talking about the unborn, you see? Can we touch nirvana in this life? We recently lost the great teacher Thich Nhat Hanh. Let me read a little quotation from him. "I laugh when I think how I once sought paradise as a realm outside the world of birth and death. It's right in this world of birth and death that the miraculous truth is revealed. But it's not the laughter of someone who suddenly acquires a great fortune. Neither is it the laughter of one who's won a great victory. It's rather the laughter of someone who, having searched everywhere for something for a long time, finds it one morning in the pocket of his coat," right? But again, finding it here and now, you see? Another quotation from Thich Nhat Hanh. "Nirvana means extinction, the extinction of all notions and concepts, including the concepts of birth, death, being, non-being, coming and going. It's the ultimate dimension of life, a state of coolness, peace, and joy. It is not a state to be attained after you die. You can touch nirvana right now by breathing, walking, drinking your tea in mindfulness. You have been nirvanized since the very non-beginning. Everything and everyone is dwelling in nirvana. Does this make sense? The idea, again, I just find it very helpful to remember what Campbell and Crossan are talking about, this, how easy it is, how often it happens, and can we really be sure it hasn't happened in our own tradition, where somehow a metaphor about realizing the unborn right here and now, which Mahayana often talks in terms of emptiness or something like that, rather than somehow thinking that the goal is ultimately not to be reborn, that the goal is ultimately to transcend this. You know, and if you go to Southeast Asian countries like Thailand, because they do take it literally for the most part, it's kind of sad the way that the reality is most people aren't interested in nirvana. They want to be reborn. They want to accumulate good merit so that they might, if not win the lottery this lifetime, be reborn into a wealthier family next time, because it's a misunderstanding of what the ultimate goal is. And I think, to say it again, and I'm going to keep coming back to this, given the kind of crisis that we face today, we need to clarify this point. So that's one side of it. That's one side of historical Buddhism. But of course, in the modern secular world now, I want to sort of touch on another way of understanding what the path is about. Because today, for many of us who don't sort of accept sort of transcendence, I think there's a way of understanding the Buddhist path that has secularized it, whereby, you know, we don't believe in something like enlightenment. We simply see the concern as attaining a certain kind of peace of mind or equanimity. And of course, what I'm talking about here is something like the mindfulness project, the mindfulness movement. And the understanding that is often, not always built into this, but the idea then that all the problems that we face are really problems on our own mind. And if we can just sort of resolve, if we can understand how our own minds work and don't cling to whatever is arising, then we can achieve some kind of harmony. It seems to me that for some Buddhists, there's a kind of solution to the ecological crisis built into this, right? What I mean by that is sometimes we read some really significant news about what's happening to the climate, like that horrible heat wave in India a couple of weeks ago. And we can become quite anxious, quite disturbed about it. But hey, we're Buddhist practitioners. We know what to do when we're anxious. So we sit facing the wall for an hour and we let go of our anxiety and we stand up and everything is okay, right? We've let go of the anxiety. The anxiety is simply in our own minds, right? Maybe that isn't such an issue for the people listening to this talk, but certainly I think, well, I've known a fair number of Buddhists who basically are not engaged ecologically or socially, because that's really the kind of frame of mind that they come from. You know, don't distract me with these issues. The real challenge is understanding how my mind works. Those responses are completely opposite to each other, but in one way they are presuming exactly the same thing. Whether we see the goal as completely transcending the world or as completely harmoniously fitting into it, what do they both presuppose? They both presuppose accepting the world as it is, right? That's the basic idea behind both. And therefore, none of them really implies any kind of social or ecological engagement, right? what I want to suggest to you, and this is kind of the focus for, what am I saying? As opposed to these two kinds of understanding of the Dharma, I want to offer a different way of understanding the Dharma that I think, if we really understand it, implies the kind of social and ecological engagement that we need today, right? The basic idea being, of course, that we experience the world, this world, in the way that we do because of the way our minds work. And if our mind changes, then the world will change. You know, I think, frankly, it's no accident that there was an explosion of interest in Buddhism and meditation centers in the 70s after the psychedelic revolution of the 60s. I know a great many Buddhist teachers and practitioners were open to the possibility, because when people took LSD or something like that, it was very different than alcohol. Your world actually transformed. And, you know, many people began to realize this deep insight about the relationship between our own minds and the external, or so-called external world, that if our minds change, that the world is going to change. To use modern language, we could say that the world as we normally experience it is a construct. It's a psychological and social construct. Babies aren't born with that construct, but in the process of growing up, we buy into it. We learn to see the world in the way that other people do. And that includes seeing ourselves in the way that other people see us, right? The sense of self, to a large degree, is internalized. We learn to see ourselves as caregivers, like our mother or someone like that sees us. We identify with the name and so forth. And the point of Buddhist practice, if we understand it from this perspective, is that it's possible to deconstruct and reconstruct the way that we experience ourselves and the way that we experience ourselves in the world, right? I think that's the really hopeful understanding that we need to move toward. And this connects very nicely, I think, with something else that's really important here. To say that the sense of separate self, in particular, is a psychological and social construct. That the self, the sense of separate self, it doesn't have any reality of its own. It's basically composed of mostly habitual ways of thinking and feeling and acting, in the way that they work together to create the sense of a self, right? What this basically implies, I think, is something really profound, that because the sense of self doesn't have any inherent separate reality, it is intrinsically insecure. Notice the word insecure. If I had to pick out one Buddhist teaching that for me is sort of gets at the most important thing of all, it would be the connection that Buddhism makes between the delusion of a separate self and dukkha, suffering in the broadest sense of the term, right? That the delusion of a separate self, that there's some dissatisfaction, frustration, dis-ease built into that. And I think we can see the point. If the sense of self is a construct, it doesn't have any reality, it's insecure. It's inherently uncomfortable. And I think we normally experience that insecurity, that's discomfort, as a sense of lack. Again, please understand what I'm trying to do here. I'm trying to give an alternative way of understanding what the Buddhist path is about here. We know the Buddhist emphasis, this very strange Buddhist emphasis on non-self. And I'm sort of trying to give a kind of, in contemporary language, trying to give a sense of how that connects with what Buddhism has always emphasized, the fundamental dukkha, the fundamental suffering. So what I want to suggest to you is that, again, to say it again, this delusion of a separate self, this insecurity, this discomfort, this dukkha, we normally experience it as a sense of lack, by which I mean the feeling that something is wrong with me. Something is missing. Something isn't quite right. I'm not good enough. Has anyone ever experienced anything like that before? I mean, frankly, we all have, right? The question is, where does it come from? And what do we do with that feeling? And how do we understand it? Where the problem, I think, occurs is we tend to project it outside ourselves. There's something out there that we lack. I think traditionally, one way to understand religion is our usual way of dealing with our sense of lack. It's how we address it. I mean, religion, think of medieval Christianity. It kind of reassures us if okay, we sinned. We bear the consequences of sin. But if we do what the church says, we do penance, then after we died, we'll go to heaven, our sense of lack will be relieved and everything will be okay. I mean, that's one example, but I think a lot of the power of religion is basically because it gives us a way to understand and resolve this sense of lack. But what about in the modern world, where so many of us have become much more secular, where, for example, we don't believe in sin? How do we understand our sense of lack today? Sorry? So, well, I'm coming from the United States, so maybe I can't say anything about England or Britain, but certainly I think one of the main secular ways of understanding my lack is that I don't have enough money. And of course, sometimes that's the case. I mean, there's a lot of poor people, but even middle class, even wealthy people can still have this strong sense. I don't have enough. I'm not a billionaire yet, right? And this applies not only to the abstraction of money, but we can talk about like consumerism in general, right? In fact, it's for this very reason that it seems to me that consumerism is the real religion of the modern age, if you really think about it. If a religion teaches us what's really important about the world and how to live in it, I think that that's the main function for most people nowadays. Huh? Assuming they have the money, and the ones who don't, they tend to aspire to that. Consumerism is the way that we understand how to become happy. It promises us that the next thing we buy is going to be happy. But again, it's this idea that I have the sense of lack, something is wrong with me. I don't have enough of this. I don't have enough money. I don't have enough consumer toys, right? If we look at it from that standpoint, I think we can see how this is kind of one of the functions of money today. I mean, money has traditional functions, medium of exchange. You can save stuff, you can save money, you can use it to make more money. But I think money has become one of the main lack projects in the modern era, both individually and collectively. I think this helps us to explain our, I think, preoccupation with money. The problem with all lack projects, though, insofar as we understand them as something out here that we lack, the problem with all of them is that whatever it is we're seeking is just a symptom of the deeper problem that Buddhism addresses, right? It's just a symptom. And so we're like trying to address the symptom, but never really getting at the core disease, the core problem there. And what that means is, in fact, it doesn't matter how much money you may get, whether you're a billionaire or not, it's never going to be enough. It's never going to assuage. It's never going to fill up that bottomless pit at the core of your being, right? And we have a wonderful myth in the Western tradition that speaks to that. Anybody know what that is? The story of Midas, exactly, right? You think about it, this fabulously wealthy Lydian king, but he wanted more. And he did a boon to the god Dionysus, who gave him this: anything you touch is going to be, it's going to turn into gold. So we had a lot of fun turning everything into gold until it was time for dinner. Ching, ching. And until his little child ran across the room to give him a hug. Ching. I think that is a really profound myth about somehow, you know, the preoccupation with money can teach us, what is it? The price of everything and the value of nothing, something like that, right? And I think it's really hard to avoid. Drinking a really, really expensive bottle of wine, not that I'm very familiar with that, but how much are we able to drink? About how much can we actually enjoy the deliciousness of the wine without also thinking about how much it cost, right? Or owning a really, really expensive car. I don't know, what's the modern version? Tesla, BMW, right? Porsche, I don't know. What's the joy of owning a really, really expensive? Is it that it's so good and fast? Well, in part, but also I'm the kind of guy that has a Porsche, right? I mean, what's going on with that? It's like, it's a kind of reality project. I feel more real. I feel special, right? I'm filling up this void by having these kinds of things. Yeah. So anyway, I think it's pretty clear that money is, let me say it this way. I think this way of understanding money is extremely powerful, because it can help really give us insight into the addictive quality of this kind of fascination, the fact that so many people are caught up in that, right? We don't believe in temples. We don't go to church to fill up our sense of lack, but we try to grab as much money as we can, right? And we call such people materialists. Interesting. I don't think they're materialists at all. They're not interested in the tangible materiality of things. The point about money is that it's an abstraction. It's a number, right? It's not the sensuous reality of experiencing, enjoying the glass of wine. It's rather somehow the numerical symbol system sort of interposes itself all the time, as is expressed in that story of Midas. Does that make any sense? Sort of making money and materialism and consumerism as a lack project, right? Another one that I think is especially potent today, more so than ever before because of our technologies of communication, is the desire for fame, right? To become famous. I mean, I think it was harder in the past when there were so few, you know, if you think about the Middle Ages, I mean, what does it mean to be famous? You don't have the internet, you don't have newspapers, you don't have magazines, you don't have television and film and all that, right? It's harder. But today, well, for example, what we're doing here today in person, and here I'm going to ignore for a moment the people who are watching online, but actually watching online is what we're doing most of the time now, right? It's like we spend most of our time watching people on screens. the actual reality of, wow, we're actually in the place. Emma's an old friend. Today we met for the first time after a couple years of COVID. This is becoming comparatively rare, especially during COVID. We're used to relating to each other through screens. And here's the interesting thing about screens. When you watch screens, there's certain people who tend to keep coming up on screens, right? Like the A-list Hollywood celebrities or the famous commentators on television, politicians, really rich people, Elon Musk and all of those. You ever notice how those are the ones that keep coming up? Whereas, sorry, you and I, well, we're kind of anonymous, that's right? For the most part, compared to that, we're kind of nobody. Can you see how that could plug into a kind of a lack project? If I could become famous, if I'm visible in the eyes of so many people, it makes me feel more real, right? Again, if this is a lack project, it doesn't matter how famous you are, it's never going to fill up that sense of void at your core. And I think we see that people ruined by fame who sort of expect something from fame that it doesn't provide. And, you know, they literally have some kind of emotional or mental illness as a result of that, right? The other thing to say about both of these lack projects and lack projects in general, lack projects are always future oriented. Right now, here and now, I'm not good enough. My life isn't good enough because I have this sense of lack, right? Something is wrong, something is missing. But in the future, when I get what I think I need, enough money, a nice enough car, if I'm famous enough, then I will be okay. So built into this is a certain way of relating to time. We're constantly sacrificing or devaluing or using right here and now simply as a means in order to get somewhere else in the future, right? So does this ring a bell? Does this sound like what we do? Is this saying something about our society? I mean, I think it's very kind of revelatory, right? I mean, we can go on with these lack projects. Let me just mention one more in particular that I think the myth of romantic love. And I'm not sure if that's as strong now as it was in my mother's day, right? For my mother's day, I think it was the idea that somewhere out there, there's this guy for me, you know, and if I just find that person and we get together, we're going to complement each other perfectly, and the problem of my life will be solved, and all you need is love, right? Anybody ever had that? I mean, that myth. I think we're a little more wary of it today. I think to some degree, it's actually sort of devolved into something a bit more physical, right? The perfect sexual partner, maybe. But I think it still survives. There's still this sense that the problem of my life is finding that other person who will somehow fill me up, you know, just. And I'm sorry? And the problem is that if we have if we impose that on a relationship, the unreasonable expectations are really going to create all kinds of problems, right? I mean, I have a couple friends I can think of, women friends in this case, who, you know, they start a relationship and there's this great romantic glow at the beginning, right? We all know what that's like. And then the romantic glow and, you know, and oh, well, I guess that's not the one, right? Because the romantic glow is gone. Again, the expectations of the relationship are too high, and it interferes. I mean, as most of us know, relationships take work. Marriages, they don't just go on perfectly by themselves. You have to actually make efforts, work through things. So that's when we learn that the romantic myth doesn't work in quite that way. Right. I'm thinking now of the example of Romeo and Juliet as maybe the great example in Western or certainly English-speaking world. One of the fascinating things about this particular LAC project, again, it's future-oriented, right? It's like once you actually get the person, it doesn't work. It's the fantasies you have about the person before you get together. And that's why Romeo and Juliet is perfect, right? It's the hassles. It's the two families can't stand each other and it's constantly dealing with the hassles. Supposing the two families said, well, you know, we don't like it, but if you really love him, it's okay. I mean, we can't imagine that. There wouldn't be any story, right? It wouldn't be the romantic myth. It's the hassles. And once they're able to get together, you know, it becomes, whose turn is it to change the baby kind of thing, you know? I think you can see the point. It's one more version of there's something out there that's going to fill me up, that's going to fill my love, right? Does this make any sense? The point with all these LAC projects, number one, they don't work because you never get it. You can't, there's symptoms. They never give you enough of what you're looking for. And number two, they're always future oriented in a way that devalues, diminishes here and now. We're always trying to get somewhere else than where we are, you see? So it makes sense. But what about Buddhism? Can we say that Buddhism is a LAC project? I remember when I started Buddhism, you know, I wanted to be enlightened. It was really cool to be enlightened, you know, for various reasons. Impress all kinds of people. Wouldn't it be great? I think Buddhism is a LAC project. The difference being it's a LAC project that can actually work, right? It's like we can treat it. I mean, I don't know that everyone treats it as a LAC project, but I certainly did, I'll be honest, and I know a lot of other people. It's a LAC project that can work in the sense that in the process of meditating or chanting, whatever your practice can be, we let go, we learn to see through these kinds of games that we're playing with ourselves. And we learn to let go and realize something about here and now, realize that from the very beginning, there has been nothing lacking, nothing that we need to achieve, right? So, as Dogen says famously, to study the self, to study the Buddha Dharma is to study the self is to forget the self. To forget or to let go of the self is to realize your intimacy with all things. Actually, my favorite version of that is by the Vedanta teacher, Nisargadatta, who put it better than anyone else I know. He said, when I look inside and see that I am nothing, that's wisdom. When I look outside and see that I am everything, that's love. Yeah, isn't that gorgeous? And he said, between these two, my life flows. Shall I say it again? When I look inside and see that I am nothing, that's wisdom. When I look outside and see that I am everything, that's love. Between these two, my life flows, right? Wisdom and love, or as we more often say in Buddhism, wisdom and compassion, the two pillars of the path, right? And of course, he shows the relationship between them, right? Wisdom is this insight, but the compassion, the love is fundamentally integrating that insight into how we actually relate to other people, how we actually live in the world, right? Now, if you're following what I'm talking about here, you can sort of begin to see the connection with social engagement, right? Buddhism traditionally, what I've tried to do is offer you my sort of third alternative take on what Buddhism is really talking about, right? That the path isn't about transcending, escaping this world, except in a metaphorical way. We transcend it in the sense that we learn. is that the word? We transcend it in the sense that through our practice, we can come to experience it in a different way. And we realize our usual way of experiencing the world is conditioned. It can be deconditioned, reconditioned, right? Right. And therefore, the whole point of the Buddhist path is transforming our mind in ways that enable that to happen. Actually, maybe I should say that better. When we are meditating or chanting, whatever our spiritual practice may be, ultimately, it's not something that we are doing, right? I am not deconstructing my sense of self when I meditate, but when I work deeply in the meditation, by letting go of whatever arises in the mind, whatever thoughts, feelings, etc., arise in the mind, deconstruction is happening. It's not that it's not that there's a sense of self that's doing it. There's simply letting go, letting go, letting go. And then what we call enlightenment or awakening is there's the deeper letting go, right? I'm reminded of also this famous line by Chogyam Trungpa, who compared enlightenment to falling out of an airplane. Are you familiar with that? Yeah. Yeah. So enlightenment is like falling out of an airplane, where the bad news is there's no parachute, lack projects, right? All the things that we've been trying to hold on to, cling to, identify with, to sort of give us some stability, some security, money, possessions, fame, romance, whatever, power, all those things, no parachute. And the good news is there's no ground. So when we let go of those, the sense of self can realize it's the freedom of its ungroundedness. Yeah. By the way, let me also emphasize that this critique of lack projects like money and fame, it doesn't imply in itself that money is bad or that fame is bad. Let's not blame the victim here. It's the problem is created because of our particular attitude toward them, right? And the reason I emphasize that is basically I've had two main teachers, both of whom were pretty well-to-do. And in retrospect, I realize I never sort of ever gave them money for their teaching. They were quite well-to-do, but they knew how to use their money. They knew how to use it to help people. And they were really good at that. I think they realize in some sense, if Buddhism says there's no sense of separate self, money isn't something that was theirs. It was an energy. It was a kind of an energy that could be used to help people. They were two great bodhisattvas, and one of the many people that they helped was me. And the same thing about fame. I'm thinking about someone like the Dalai Lama, maybe the most famous Buddhist in the world, right? Nobel Peace Prize and all that. But he strikes me as somebody who's not caught up in the lack project of fame, right? I mean, he's somebody who pretty clearly sees through that, but he also sees the fame enables him to teach in certain ways. So he's able to use that because he's not identified with it in the way that I might be. He's able to sort of play with the possibilities that freely that opens up for him, right? Does that make any sense? let me give a few more examples about the process of letting go from the Buddhist tradition, right? I just realized I forgot these, right? From the Vimalakirti Sutra. The Dharma is not a secure refuge. He who enjoys a secure refuge is not interested in the Dharma, but in a secure refuge. It's interesting, right? It's like in the way the Dharma starts out as our refuge, but ultimately it's saying we have to let go of that, right? Huang Bo, an early Chan master, said, "Men are afraid to forget their minds, fearing to fall through the void with nothing to stop their fall. They don't know that the void is not really void, but the realm of the real Dharma. Their own mind is the void." Padmasambhava, when mind looks into itself, it finds no place from where it arises, remains, or goes. There's no explanation of this is how it is. It is experienced as a great original wakefulness without center or edge, an immense all-pervasiveness that's primordial, free, and empty. And from the Diamond Sutra, the great line that supposedly awakened the sixth patriarch. Let your mind arise without fixing it anywhere. According to the sixth patriarch, this verse precipitated his awakening, and certainly his teachings make the same point. Quote, when our mind works freely without any hindrance, can come and go freely without sticking, that's liberation. Huang Po emphasized that he had no system of Dharma to transmit. What I do to my disciples is to liberate them from their own bondage with such devices as the case may need, right? Let me finish with a quotation from someone who's not a Buddhist, but a well-known writer, David Foster Wallace. People familiar with him? Are you familiar with his commencement address at Kenyon College? He was invited to give to the graduating seniors. And it's the most amazing commencement address I've ever heard. So I just want to read a little bit of it to you, because what he's doing is really talking about lack projects, right? In the day-to-day trenches of adult life, there's actually no such thing as atheism. No such thing as not worshiping. Everyone worships. The only choice you get is what to worship. And an outstanding reason for choosing some sort of spiritual type thing is that pretty much anything else you worship will eat you alive. If you worship money and things, if they are where you tap real meaning in life, then you'll never have enough, never feel you have enough. That's the truth. Worship your own body and beauty and sexual allure, and you will always feel ugly. And when time and age start showing, you will die a million deaths before you actually die physically. That reminded me of another one of the lack projects I talked, right? Our own bodies. I remember I read, I don't know how I was reading this, but something about this supermodel, Claudia Schiffer, is there, right? And it was interesting. She's one of the most famous right? And she was complaining about, she had a little bit of cellulite right here. And she was just going on and on about that cellulite. It's like, again, if your body is your lack project, it's never going to be beautiful. It's never going to be, for men, you're never going to be buff enough. It's the same process, I mean, that doesn't mean we should ignore our bodies, but we shouldn't make them our lack projects, right? On one level, we know all this stuff already. The trick is keeping this truth up front in daily consciousness. Worship power, another lack project. Think about, well, what does he say? Worship power, you will feel weak and afraid, and you'll need ever more power over others to keep the fear at bay. I think of Stalin, Mao Zedong, maybe Putin. It's kind of craziness. If power is your thing, you're never going to have enough. What does that mean? You know, worship your intellect, being seen as smart, you're going to end up feeling stupid, a fraud, always on the verge of being found out. I know that one well as a retired professor, you know, the game we play, right? Trying to impress our colleagues and worried I'll say or do something that will reveal that I don't really know as much as I think I do or want to do. Does that make sense? It's all over academia. Yeah. I'm sorry? It's low sense of, yeah, and that too. Low sense of self-esteem is just the obverse, we're not good enough, yeah, which is simply the kind of congealing of that sense of lack, which kind of despair or, I'm not going to be able to overcome it. Anyway, a little bit more to end here. Look, says David Foster Wallace, the insidious thing about these forms of worship is not that they're sinful or evil, that they're mostly unconscious. They're default settings, the kind of worship you just gradually fall into, slip into day after day, getting more selective about what you see and how you measure the world without being fully aware that that's what you're doing. And the world won't discourage you from doing this, because the world of men and money and power hums along quite nicely on the fuel of fear and contempt and frustration and craving and the worship of itself. Wow. Our own present culture has harnessed these forces in ways that have yielded extraordinary wealth and comfort and freedom for some people, he says. But there's all different types of freedom, and the kind that's most precious you won't hear much talked about in the great outside world of winning and achieving and displaying. The really important kind of freedom involves attention and awareness and discipline and effort, and being able truly to care about other people and to sacrifice, to serve them over and over in myriad little petty ways every day. That's real freedom, he says. The alternative is unconsciousness, the default setting, the rat race. The constant gnawing sense of having had and lost some infinite thing. So I offer this to you as an alternative way of understanding the Buddhist path. And it seems to me that this opens up very nicely into responding appropriately to the challenge of social and ecological engagement, right? This path is about letting go of the lack projects that distort the way that interfere with the way that I experience and relate to you, letting go of those so that we can let go and realize our non-duality, our intimacy with other people, like Dogen talks about. And as we do that, as we see through the delusion of separate self and the dukkha involved with that, as we open up to the world, what do we encounter? What do we experience? Well, if we're paying attention, what we're opening up to is the most dangerous moment in human history. And we feel a kind of spontaneous, natural sense of wanting to do the best we can in response. I mean, it really seems to me when I grasp the reality of this challenge, it can cut through a lot of the bullshit of life, I think. You know, it can really sort of clarify, what do I want to do? What do we want to do in our time, in our brief time on this earth? I guess you could call that the positive side of it. But it brings us back to that. It brings us back to the things that we'll be talking about in the workshop tomorrow, especially a slightly new way of understanding the bodhisattva or ecosattva path. Yeah. So maybe I'll stop there and leave it at that for the moment. With apologies at the beginning, I think I was a bit I wasn't very clear. So, but I hope nonetheless that the main point came through, that I think today, this is a crisis for our tradition. We need to be clear. We need to be clear what's metaphor. We need to be clear what's not to be taken literally. We need to be clear what our practice is and how our practice can help us engage with the world. So, so that for me kind of sets the stage for looking in more detail at the sort of ecological implications of our practice. I hope that made some sense in the end. Yeah. Thank you.
Anybody here have any questions? Do it in the chat.
Or comments. Doesn't have to be a question.
Or if anyone online has any questions or anything they want to say, just let us know.
Yes, please. Doesn't have to be a question, can be a comment, criticism, whatever. Feel free. Emma? The unborn.
My mind drew the parallel between what we embodied the unborn and somehow went between stories about Armageddon and dystopian futures and stories of technical fixed futures in terms of, you know, the related crises, ecological crises. Something about how would it be, how would we see things and act differently with the unborn in mind between these polarities of disaster, peace versus is all going to. And I'm just dwelling in that. I don't
Right.
know the answer.
Right.
If you could say more, that would be great.
So it's really a question about how the unborn helps us address the kind of orient. Right. Okay. Yeah. Well, let me say what I can. I mean, part of the problem with the unborn is articulating it. So one way to say it is that the unborn is in a way taking the place, serving the role of the usual deluded sense of separate self. In other words, that the claim is that's there. And the way I see that playing out personally, and you know, we can have a discussion here. I'm reminded of that great little dialogue that Men had with a student when the student asked him, what's the fruit of a lifetime of practice? What do we learn from all our years of meditating, sitting on the cushion and all that? And he simply answered, and again, he didn't talk about transcending, he didn't talk about some other dimension of reality. He just said, responding appropriately. So the unborn not having any sort of fixed form or, you know, nothing sticking. I mean, that's one aspect of it, right? No, that it enables us to be fully aware, fully present, and fully, therefore, able to respond appropriately to whatever the situation may be. That so it opens us up to that ability. I mean, compare it to our usual sense of self, you know. I mean, on the one hand, so often it's sort of, you know, there's a situation, well, you know, how can I get what I want out of this? You know, what's in it for me? I mean, I think that's what the sense of self is about, a sense of my well-being is separate from your well-being. And so in normal situations, there's always some element of that. But the idea of responding appropriately is sort of going beyond that, acting out of the unborn, which has no sort of, presuppositions about, and I think it also fits in very nicely with the Zen teaching in particular on don't know mind, sort of like really open to what's happening. Somehow avoiding so much of that luggage that we're usually carrying with us. Yeah. Does that make any sense? Yeah. Please.
Question
Sure.
from the chat online.
Sure.
Could engaging with social and ecological issues be done in a way that it also becomes a lack project?
So I don't know whether people could hear that. Could engaging in social and ecological issues be done in such a way that it becomes a lack project? For sure. For sure. That's a very real danger. And in fact, I think we see people falling into that all the time in reality. But it's interesting, I think in the context of Buddhism, well, let me just say it this way. What we're really talking about is the Bodhisattva path, the Bodhisattva project. And Bodhisattvas have a double-sided practice. They continue to work on their own awakening, seeing through the things, the lack projects that would distort that kind of activity, even as they engage in that kind of activity. So, yeah, I mean, if you're doing it because you're playing some game, trying to be special, I guess that would be a very good example, trying to be special, then that would definitely be a lack project. But if you're meditating, it really helps us see the game that we're playing with ourselves. Sorry, I'm just repeating myself now. Yeah. And there's no guarantee that it won't be a lack project, but I mean, I think there's something built into the practice, just like if enlightenment is our lack project, but we really go deeply into the practice, that lack project kind of deconstructs itself, And I think it's the same with engagement, that if we are meditating, if we're doing it in that attitude, it would really help us see through that as a lack project. Yeah. Any other comments or thoughts? Feel free. We talked about a lot of different things, and I'm sorry, this in the teaching. Mhm. So maybe I should just mention for people who might be watching that there's a current or a thread here in what I've been saying that is very consistent with your own teachers and what you've learned from them. Mhm. Yeah. I was just thinking about Bernie too. Isn't he a great example of that? Yeah. Yeah. Yep. That's right. Right. So talking about the Zen Peacemakers as an example, the 3 tenets of the Zen Peacemakers, right? Bearing witness, well, not knowing, bearing witness, and then acting in ways that respond to that, right? I mean, I think you're exactly right that those are really good examples. The language is different, but I think that those are really good examples of what I've been trying to point to. I mean, I think there are some challenges that, I mean, Zen peacemakers can't do everything, so they were focusing in certain areas. When we come to things like ecological crisis, there's this dimension of institutionalization. What I mean by that is it seems to me that the three poisons have been institutionalized. In particular, if greed means we never have enough, then I think that's a pretty good description of our economic system, you know. And let's be frank, one of the main reasons we're not doing enough in response to the ecological crisis is that there are wealthy and powerful people, mostly men, who, you know, largely control the economic system and also largely control the political system. And they're making, you know, the system now is just working too well for them, you see. So that's one reason why it's, so there's this institutionalization side, or let's say political side, that the Zen Peacemakers didn't go into. And I think it's something that we do need to sort of look at and try to sort of expand their concern beyond that. Yeah. I'm sort of hesitating what to say because that's part of what we'll be talking about in the workshop tomorrow. Yeah. How we might understand that and how that might work. Yeah.
Can I make a comment? Mariano here. Because I've been training for many, many years with the Zen group. And nowadays I am sitting with the Forest Sangha as well, Ajahn Chah's. And it seems to me that many...
Please. Yeah, please.
So thank you everybody online. Thank you everybody who was here in person today. And thank you particularly to David. Thank you so much for your wonderful talk. I can see the people here in person. And I know their minds are whirling or whirring. And I think David's touched a lot of points for people. So so thank you so much, David.
I do want to say and apologize. I'm a part of it was sort of thinking out loud. And, you know, when I said at the beginning, it's rough, I think it was, especially at the beginning, you could see me sort of trying to talk around it. But I also hope you can appreciate that those issues, whether or not my view is something you want to accept, I think those are exactly the kinds of issues that we need to be thinking about today. So thank you for joining me with that.
Thank you so much. And so goodbye to everybody online. I hope you've enjoyed it. And those of you who are coming to the workshop tomorrow, we look forward to seeing you at 10 o'clock in the morning. Otherwise, good night.
I think it's 11 o'clock, if I remember right.
Is it? Oh, sorry, 11 o'clock in the morning. Oh, that shocked you quickly there, didn't it? 11 o'clock in the morning. Otherwise, thank you very much.
You can sleep a little later.
Yes, indeed. And thank you so much and good night.
And thank you, Jamie, and everyone who put this all together.